Hey there, I'm Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings. Happy to be joined by Anthony Cheung by way of Kentucky via beautiful San Francisco visual background. Hey Anthony, how you doing?
Hey Dan, good to see you.
Thanks for hopping on Zoom. So wonderful album of yours coming out this Friday, August 12th, All Roads. This is your second New Focus release, and really excited to be hosting this again. So thanks for entrusting us with this great material.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on the label. Love what you do as always. So thank
Great.
you for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. So, well, uh, there's a sort of, I don't know if it's an intentional or an unintentional through line, I think, on this album of pieces that sort of reference or recontextualize some sort of pre-existing sources, both musical and also literary. Was that something that uh, you were? Well, I guess I mean the pieces weren't written for the album per se. So, and I think maybe it's fair to say that that's something that is a point of interest for you in general.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly. I think that's a through line that's in my work in general
Yeah.
to varying degrees. But sometimes it's musical, sometimes it's literary, sometimes it's visual. So, but yeah, referencing of existing material or historical material and recontextualization for sure. So yes, it wasn't something that I was thinking ahead to an album per se, but it just kind of all
Yeah.
came together. I think the greater thing that ties everything together is that it's chamber music and that it's really focused on primarily strings and piano and the voice.
Right. Cool. Uh, well, let's actually use the pieces as a way to sort of get into the conversation a little bit. The title track is the first piece on the record. It's for piano and string quartet. It's an 8 movement piece, and it sort of uses a famous tune by Billy Strayhorn, "Lotus Blossom," as a jumping off point. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So the piece is called All Roads. As you mentioned, it's in eight sections, and it's a piano quintet written for the pianist, the wonderful pianist Gil Van Sadel, who was very instrumental in making it happen as a commission through Music Accord, which is an organization that commissions new work for chamber music, and also the incredible musicians of the Escher String Quartet. So they premiered it in 2018, and there was an original version that had some slight revisions with the ordering of movements and other material. So the second version, the revised version, is I think the final complete version that appears on the disc. And All Roads, the title refers to um, a the original subtitle, or the original title, I should say, of the tune Lotus Blossom by Billy Strayhorn. All Roads Lead Back to You. That was his original title for the song. I've been really drawn to his work, and he's one of my favorite musicians and composers for a long time. And in particular, this song Lotus Blossom has a kind of had this haunting effect over me. It was actually Duke Ellington's favorite tune of Strayhorn's, and it has this very bittersweet shading to it. A lot of it has to do with the chromaticism, the falling chromaticism of the lines and the ambiguity of the harmony. And so my intention was to use that as a kind of like a jumping off point, not to rewrite the song or to even like write variations on it or reference it very clearly, but to use the mood of the piece and the profile of the song as a kind of jumping off point to um, new ideas that I could explore. So the opening of the piece is, in a way, closest to that source material. It traces the melody, again, in a very oblique way, but the falling semitones, half steps of that melody get displaced immediately at the offset by the piano, with huge registral leaps. But if you know the tune, you can kind of trace where it's coming from. And if you don't, it might sound like something that is based on something else, but not quite, you know. And I would say that it's primarily the melodic profile, that falling chromaticism, that has its biggest trace throughout these 8 movements. I bring them back in various ways, but rhythms, harmonies completely shift, completely get recontextualized. And the overall form of the piece consists of what are known as detour movements, basically like detouring away further and further away from the song until we get to the third one, which basically is like furthest away from the source. And then also kind of main movements that form the kind of meat of the piece, that are not quite as tethered to the original idea.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely feel like I would hear little sort of whispers of the tune here and there, listening through the piece. And it's cool. It's almost like the original was sort of your muse in envisioning the whole thing. With the detours, were you sort of thinking of it like each one was a further sort of distillation of the original idea, so that you were taking the previous detour and then distilling it to the next detour, or it was more sort of just like casting out in all different directions?
I would say, yeah, further and further layers and distillations.
It's almost like a palimpsest type.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
And that idea ties in nicely with an idea that hopefully we'll talk about with All Thorn, the vocal and piano piece, which takes translation and further complicates it through retranslation and back translation. So almost like a game of telephone. So yeah, the detouring and telephoning is kind of like a theme of the disc.
Yeah, very cool. Well, let's listen to a little bit of All Roads. We were going to check out an excerpt from the fourth movement, Circuitous Routes, Winding Passacalias. Did you want to say something, or should we just take a listen?
Sure, I can. Well, let's take a listen and then we can talk about it afterward.
Great.
So this I think we're going to start is about halfway through the movement, and then we're going to not go fully through the movement, but we'll fade out close to the end.
Perfect. Great. So that was an excerpt from the fourth movement of All Roads. Gilles von Sattel on piano, and the Escher Quartet, which is Adam Barnett Hart, Danby on violins, Pierre Lapointe on viola, and Brooks Speltz on cello. Sorry. Uh, so you want to say a little bit about the material in that excerpt?
Sure, that is coming from the fourth movement, and it's kind of placing us right in the middle of this 25-minute piece. And had we listened about a minute or 45 seconds further, we would have gotten to the end of the movement. So I encourage you to check out the whole movement. But it is in Passacaglia form, this movement, although very loosely. So I call it winding Passacaglias. There is a kind of circular chord progression that keeps spiraling in different directions. So it picks up steam, picks up chords along the way, picks up other detours from its original progression along the way. And so what you heard at that moment was the through line of that Passacaglia, especially in the piano, kind of hammering out single notes that are associated with that chord progression, but then flurry of activity surrounding it in the rest of the piano and in the strings, which is at this point, at least in the opening of that excerpt, like purely texture, lots of pizzicatos, cross rhythms, reacting to the piano with, cross fades and other things. And then we get to a kind of breaking point with the chords. And yeah, so where we stopped were this kind of like monolithic restatement of the Passacaglia. But when we first heard it at the beginning of the movement, it had been in very shadowy, suggested form. And now it's like very much like big vertical chords, sonorities, monoliths, and continues to rise higher and higher, and eventually kind of by the end of the movement dissipates. So yeah, that's, I knew I wanted to have a moment in the piece where the piano and strings really just kind of created this big dramatic push towards something very, very vertical like that.
Cool. Yeah, it's a great moment right in the sort of middle of the piece that I think represents a sort of a peak in the overall structure. Should we go on to talk a little bit about the violin sonata?
Sure.
So this is Elective Memory, which is sort of an interesting combination of two ideas, right? Like the title itself. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the title itself is an allusion to both selective memory, the idea of selective memory, which definitely plays out in this piece, and elective affinity, which was an idea that Goethe made famous. It was kind of like this pseudoscientific idea that he had, where about chemicals, like and how people's relations were guided by these chemical reactions. So I like to think that it had something to do with Beethoven as well, because Jennifer Koh, back in 2015, 2014, 2015, was working on a project called Bridge to Beethoven, where she commissioned several composers to write response pieces to Beethoven violin piano sonatas, which she was performing as part of a cycle that year. So the others were Andrew Norman and Vijay Iyer. And I chose my response to the Opus 96 sonata, the final sonata, which happens to be Jenny's favorite and my favorite. And yeah, I immediately thought of several ideas. One of this is this hovering idea of selective memory. I had written another violin and piano sonata earlier when I was 18, actually, and kind of forgot about it, consciously forgot about it for a long time, but wanted to bring it back in some way into this new piece. And so that was like the selective aspect of the memory. And I also felt like there was an elective affinity between from Jenny and I with this music of Beethoven. So that was a little play on the title.
Cool. Uh, I was lucky to be a fly on the wall for this session when you and Miranda Cookson recorded it, and I it's such a sort of beautiful and lush sound world, and I sort of it has a sort of fantasy quality to it. So when I read the thing about the Goethe connection, I felt like there was this sort of quality of I don't know, romantic angst floating through this piece a little bit, which was cool.
Mm.
So we were maybe going to check out the beginning of the second movement, right? Broken Scherzo, tripping up, falling down. You want to set this up a little bit?
Sure. So the piece is in 3 movements, and the first is kind of like a introductory, and it has the most outright allusions to the Beethoven Opus 96. Actually, the opening gesture is a kind of slowed down version of the kind of quote unquote bird call trill that opens the piece, the Beethoven, in G major. And in the second movement, I'm also alluding to kind of like the second phrase of the Beethoven, which is, we don't necessarily even hear it as a phrase, but almost as like a tail of a phrase, which is a kind of like a broken arpeggio, da da dee da dee da dee da dum, and I kind of loop that da da dee da 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 dee da dum as a broken arpeggio that becomes this kind of like sine wave form. And I wanted to use that as material in sharp contrast to that quote from the early piece of mine that I mentioned earlier. So the movement opens with this kind of flurry of activity of fast 16th notes between the piano and the violin, and then immediately is interrupted by that kind of sine wave motion. Also, the 2 instruments locked in sync, in rhythmic sync, and then it keeps getting interrupted again by the opening material. So it's this constant back and forth between the fast material and the reflective Beethovenian sine wave material.
Very cool. Let's take a listen. This is second movement of Violin Sonata Elective Memory. We're listening to Miranda Cookson on the violin and Anthony Cheung himself on piano. Broken Scherzo, tripping up, falling down, about the first minute and a half or so. Great. So, well, you mentioned before the last um, the last piece on the album, "All Thorn but Cousin to Your Rose," sort of tangles a bit with the notion of translation, like more literally, text translation. You want to talk about sort of how you came to think about writing this piece and there was like a little bit of a detour in this as well when you discovered a Nabokov essay, right?
Yeah. So the original idea came when I was, you know, being increasingly fascinated by Google Translate and all of the rabbit hole that opened up in terms of translations, and then translations of translations, and translations into different languages, and back translations into the original language, and then via other languages. So I kind of put in the back of my head that I wanted to make a piece with texts using this idea. And then I came upon Nabokov's essay, originally published in the New Republic in the 1940s, about the difficulties and perils and impossibilities of translation. And this was actually before he embarked on his mammoth undertaking of translating Eugene Onegin of Pushkin, which he had done in the late 1950s, early 60s. So he was always very skeptical of the idea of translation and doing the original text any justice. And the essay that he wrote in the New Republic is a great illustration of that, in sardonic tone, but also hammering home a lot of important points. So I wanted to use that text as part of the material for this piece, All Thorn but Cousin to Your Rose. So the piece starts out using that text of his in abridged form, laying out the major points of perils of translation. And then it goes into, and while that happens, he gives some examples of how translation ultimately fails. There's a great passage of where he talks about the Russian rendering of a passage of Shakespeare in Hamlet, and how it comes back, with richer flowers than, as he says, the poor weeds that she found. And so I kind of take that idea and run with it, and I continue to put those lines into Google Translate into other languages, and then back translate them into English. So there's a French version, there's a Polish version, there's a Japanese version, and as that accumulates, the text goes further and further away from the original meaning, to the point of absurdity. And so that all happens in the first section as Nabokov had no idea of Google Translate, of course, but this idea of back translation, and I think was in the back of his head as he was thinking about how ridiculous it could get,
Yeah.
because he had been asked to do a back translation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells, by what he says in the essay, a quote famous Russian composer who happened to be Rachmaninoff, and Poe's poem had been translated by Konstantin Balmont into Russian, and Rachmaninoff had asked Nabokov to translate it back into English from the Russian, but preserving the rhythm of the Russian. And this idea appalled him. So I there's a little tip of the hat to that in the second section, where there's a setting of the original Poe Bells poem. And there's a connection between that and the final section of the work, which is where I actually do set two stanzas from Nabokov's translation of Pushkin of Onegin, because there's in Onegin there's a lot of imagery of sleigh bells, and wintry imagery as well. So yeah, that's all to say that the piece itself goes on a lot of detours. It opens with this illustration of Nabokov's essay, then it goes to some detours illustrating that with the Poe and the Google Translate stuff. There's also a sonnet, a short sonnet that Nabokov composed in 1955 that was printed in the New Yorker called "What is Translation?" That is the third part of this monodrama. And then in the last section, it is the two stanzas from Eugene Onegin that Nabokov translated. And there, I just leave it there completely untouched as a kind of homage to Nabokov and his ultimately very beautiful and expressive way of translating this work.
Very cool. Yeah, there's a quality, you really captured this sort of intellectual jousting that sort of, well, it might have been mostly in his own mind, but all these different texts coming in and out, and the way that you set the vocal part differently depending on what the nature of the text is, and it's really it's a very dynamic piece. Even though it's only for one singer, there's a sense that there's many different characters sort of embedded within it, which is really cool. And then there's this great link, like you said before, back to All Roads, in the sense that we have these sort of several different evolving iterations of some of the same types of material, and the sort of process of translation and how that might manifest itself in musical material evolving. And so
yeah, and I have to say that the soprano Paulina Swierczek does a fantastic job of embodying the very different roles that I set out for her to sing in this piece and speak as well, because the Nabokovian element is like him as lecturer is like mostly spoken. And she has her kind of lecturer cap on at the opening of the piece. But then later, with the sung material and, especially at the end, which is like very lyrical, she has to wear many hats in the piece. And that goes back to, there's another piece that we haven't talked about yet, but if I can just get a quick word in, it's called Character Studies, a solo violin piece that Miranda Cookson records on this album. And in that piece too, she has to wear many hats, constantly shifting personalities between something that is very extroverted at the beginning and then kind of more introverted and then kind of more ambivalent, and that all happens within a matter of seconds. So that's another through line for this album, is just like one person taking on multiple personas within this piece, and sometimes within the same phrase.
Very cool. Well, let's take a listen to the opening movement of All Thorn. This is Three Grades of Evil. And of course, Jacob Greenberg, wonderful pianist, is joining Pauline Swierczek, soprano.
Three grades of evil can be discerned in the queer world of verbal transmigration. The first and lesser one comprises obvious errors due to ignorance or misguided knowledge. This is mere human frailty and thus excusable. The next step to hell is taken by the translator, who intentionally skips words or passages that he does not bother to understand, or that might seem obscure or obscene to vaguely imagined readers. He accepts the blank look that his dictionary gives him without any qualms, or subjects scholarship to primness. He is as ready to know less than the author, as he is.
Wonderful. It was so great to get a chance to chat and to listen to some of your new album, Anthony. FCR263 All Roads comes out August 12th, this Friday. Before I forget, I just want to shout out some credits. All tracks were recorded at Octavian Audio by Ryan Strieber. You executive produced it, and Jacob Greenberg did some assistant production, and the design and layout was Mark Wolf. The beautiful cover photo behind me is Thomas Fichter, and Ewan Matthew Mendez wrote the liner notes. So wonderful album, available all the places that you would expect to buy and not buy music. And thanks again, Anthony. Congratulations, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate everything that you put into this and the label and all the musicians and everyone. It means a lot.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.